Securities offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through CWM, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC is under separate ownership from any other named entity. Carson Partners, a division of CWM, LLC, is a nationwide partnership of advisors. This is The Way to Wealth, with host Scott Ford, a jiu-jitsu fighting, woodworking, beekeeping entrepreneur who is also the managing director, partner, and wealth advisor of Carson Wealth. Financial freedom is the goal, and clarity and simplicity is how we'll get there. Let's get to it. This is Way to Wealth.
Hello, and welcome back to the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple, allowing you the ability to fully live and to do it now instead of 30 years from today. Super excited today to have a friend of mine, John Ratliff, on the podcast to share some knowledge. So first, let me just say welcome, John.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah, man. Likewise. It's Zoom time with COVID times, but it's all good. At least we have it. But yeah. So a little bit about John's background. Certainly I know it, but 25 years experience as an entrepreneur and CEO. And basically, I mean, John implemented Rock Habits and other best practices to start Apple Tree, but then acquired, I think it was 26 other companies in doing that, and implemented these best practices with just all kinds of benefits to the team members and to the people that they were serving through them. So he, in doing that, drove multiples, valuations, and value they were delivering like none other in that space. It was basically call centers were the company that he had and that what he was buying. And so John brings all kinds of not just knowing in this space, but he's lived it. It's one thing, and that's who I love to have on the podcast. It's one thing someone writes a book and puts info out there, and look, I've done that. John's also lived it, right? So it's like he's took the best practices he learned from Vern and others, but then he actually did something with it. So it was like, for me, my first acquisition, I was talking about it. And at some point you got to be about it, because you don't know what you don't know until you actually do it. So excited to have John on. He's a doer. And I know has some knowledge to share. So again, thanks for joining Way to Wealth podcast, John.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I agree. It's you can talk about it till you're blue in the face, but till you sleep under the desk and worry about making payroll and do an acquisition with, a well-intentioned checklist, but first time you've ever done it, experience is always the best teacher.
That makes the best checklist, doesn't it?
It
Actually
does.
Doing it.
Yeah.
Hundreds.
Makes the second checklist a lot better.
Exactly. So he that's it. He's a doer. And so with that, and then of course being part and founding the scaling up coaching arm of what was Rockefeller Habits. John knows this stuff as good as anyone I know. So, look, typically audience here is business owners, most of who resonate with this message are a lot like me. They're typically businesses 5 million to 100 million in revenue. And the reason for the podcast, as I said many times, it's me scratching my own itch. And it's the way I've always been in business. It's like, all right, this isn't working well. And so where I saw a gap was just these business owners from 5 million to 100 million in revenue needing a virtual family office, basically, or needing a family office, but not having enough assets. So that's the reason for the Way to Wealth. That's the whole, they're the people we're looking to serve through this process. And so as I said before in the podcast, really why? What's the point of it all? So I live my life off of the framework of health, wealth, wisdom, and happiness. And then what's underneath that? Well, under health is spiritual, mental, physical health. And under wealth is financial freedom. Well, that's what the Way to Wealth brings to the table. But there's other processes too. Having enough is wealth. And then having love in your life is real wealth. And then in wisdom, living in the present moment. So that's some Eckhart Tolle, Michael Singer stuff there. Having lots of experiences, because experiences create wisdom, and then being a lifelong learner. That's my frame for wisdom. And then happiness, part of what I want to talk to John about today is having relationships, because relationships, healthy relationships, I believe, bring happiness. Having a dream you contribute to, that you are contributing to, I think bring happiness. And then being grateful. So one of the things I wanted to chat with you about, John, is exit and planning for that for these business owners. I know you got a lot to share there. And then happiness on having a dream that you can contribute to, because I know I've seen it, but you've seen it a lot more, where people sell, but without still having some sort of dream, it's just hard to keep the momentum on the happiness. So I know you have experience there with the work you've done. Would love you to share with the audience here some of that knowledge.
Yeah, no, it's, I think, I've shared with you before, there's 1,000 books a year written on management and leadership and, culture and all the, the blocking and tackling basics of business. And those are all about income. And obviously income's, wildly important, and we should all be focused on that. But, the ultimate piece to the puzzle is the wealth event, and the wealth event is the exit. And there's this mindset around a lot of our peers, a lot of fellow entrepreneurs that say, I'll worry about that later. I'm never going to exit. I don't want to sell the business. But exit doesn't mean necessarily sell the business. It means, what's the next phase? What's the transition? Maybe you give it to your employees. Maybe you do an ESOP. Maybe you sell it to your kids, or give it to your kids, or maybe you shut it down. But, if you're going to be intentional about that next phase, it takes, like everything else in life, planning. And so many times, because it's scary, or we don't want to think about it, or, we don't want to face the ultimatum that we're all going to exit at some point, we don't do the proper planning there. And, the last thing you want to do is leave your family with a mess, or leave your kids with a mess, or, leave your employees in a bad place because you didn't properly think through that exit. And you've spent all this energy and time to build this asset. It's really important that at the next phase, how to best nurture that asset to its new place. That very well could be selling it, and that's the traditional path, and that's the wealth event. And you talk about purpose and post-transaction, and how do you build meaning, and that's that potentially gives you the wherewithal and the economic resources to maybe create a little bit more meaning in your life and some other lives. But the converse to that is, if you spend, and we've seen it hundreds, thousands of times, where you spend 15, 20, 30 of your most formative years, you build this asset, you weren't intentional about how to exit it, and then it all falls apart at the end, or you sell it for a suboptimal price or to an unscrupulous buyer, and you're actually going to do a lot to damage your happiness at that point. And we know, and I personally know, unfortunately, dozens or hundreds of entrepreneurs that kind of live a life of regret, because at the goal line, at the most important moment, they fumbled. And, now what should have been, the greatest event of their life turns into one that they regret the rest of their days. And it's tragic. And listen, this is not lost on savvy buyers. There are savvy buyers out there that know how to extract. There's a reason that, private equity returns 25 to 30% compounded annual returns a year. They're not overpaying for companies. And in many cases, they're significantly underpaying for companies at the expense of the entrepreneur and their family. So it's kind of become my life's work and again, we're not trying to take advantage of buyers any more than we want our sellers taken advantage of. What we really focus on is, how do you structure a win-win transaction where everyone can walk away and feel like, okay, that was fair. I got what I needed, and there's a real future. And I can't tell you, if we look at 100 precedent transactions, about 90 of the 100 will be one-sided one way or the other. And it's almost always the buyer beat the seller. And it's just not a healthy way for us to sustain, growth in our economy, and win-lose transactions in the long run don't create value. And we're about win-win transactions. So
it's why you're on, man. That's exactly it. I sensed that from you when we first met, years and years ago. And then the more I got to know you, it's exactly right. And we work together. So I've been on the buy side a couple of times. I've been on the sell side. I've been through both. And without any doubt, it has to be a win for both. It should always be a win for both parties. And there's a way to do that. And there's lots of reasons why it needs to be a win for both parties. I mean, it's not just, certainly it's the right thing to do. And even if you were to set that aside, which you never should do, in my opinion, nonetheless, the point is, even financially, it makes sense for it to be a win-win for a long-term sustainable type of, project and acquisition. And so, man, so many places we could go here, but it just makes me think, even if you just think of, laws of nature, it's part of the predicament I believe we're in right now, is that, we're not following natural laws. And, that's one of them. You just said it, a win-win. I mean, and that's what nature does, yes, it takes something or it does its part, but it's always a way to give back. And I think that that's certainly critical in an acquisition play. You, for sure, as business owners and entrepreneurs, which we are, and that's the audience, this is it. Like, it's always your biggest asset is your business. And so this isn't time for amateur hour. One of the questions, that I have for you is, there's all kinds of phases. People are going to be listening and they're a year in on this startup. A lot of who listens to this podcast are people like me. So they're not typically that, although we did just launch a new business, Legado Family, last year. We'll talk about another time, but most of this audience is 25 years and beyond. So they're mature businesses. When's the right time to start thinking about this? And then how do you go about starting that process?
Yeah. So at the risk of sounding like a cliche, the best time to think about it is obviously the day that you found the company. But in more practical terms, there's some things you can do, even if you're a 25-year-old company that may be 5, 10, 15 years away from the exit. There's some things you can start to do today that actually return ancillary benefits and also get you ready for the sale. So the number one thing on that list, and it's, I think, the most important thing, whether you're going to sell the company or run it, until your last breath, is, as an entrepreneur, how do you make yourself redundant in the business? How do you create a business that can operate completely independent of you? And that obviously goes a long way towards building value. Put yourself in the shoes of a buyer. It's all about risk and risk management. If you're completely integral to the company and you're the entrepreneur, that is an added risk. It's going to detract from the value. The proverbial bus comes along and runs you over, or you get disenchanted because you got a big pile of money. Every buyer thinks they're going to give you money and you're going to run away and never work another day in your life. But all those things add risk for the buyer. But the ancillary benefit of making yourself redundant, even if you don't want to sell the company right now, it gives you better work-life balance, I think, is a myth. It gives you better work-life integration. It gives you the freedom to do some things that maybe you wouldn't do if you were tied to the business. It also gives you some risk protection that, should you get sick, should you get disabled, should you get disenchanted and you're burned out and you need 3 months off, the more you've made yourself redundant, the more anti-fragile the business. So that's number one. And that's what we teach at Scaling Up. It's all about, how do you make the entrepreneur redundant in the business? In our best case scenario, we feel like the entrepreneur is critical 8 days a year, 1 annual planning session that takes 2 days, and 3 quarterly planning sessions that take 2 days. Those are the 8 days you really have to be on as the entrepreneur. The other 300 and whatever that is, 57 days, you're free to do, what you choose. And that would be the first step. And another thing, Scott, that we talk about all the time is this idea of, and it's a really fun exercise. It's fun to go through as a leader and an entrepreneur. It's fun for the senior team, but understanding the strategic value of your business over and above the cash flow. So every business has a financial value, and that's very simple. You're a wealth manager, you know how to do discounted cash flow. That's the financial value of the business. But then we talk about this idea called Rembrandt's in the attic. Not my original statement. I was a guy named Andrew Sherman that coined the phrase. I always like to give Andrew credit. But I want you to think about, you're going to buy a home that's listed for $1 million. And there's 3 buyers. You're one of the 3. I'm one, and there's a third buyer. And maybe I really like the kitchen, and I might pay 1.05. You might not like the man cave so much. So you might be at $950, and the other buyer might be, all right, we're right at $1 million. The 3 of us are going to bid on that home and essentially be in more or less the same price range. But now I find out, the seller doesn't know this, you don't know, and the other buyer doesn't know, but I learn that hidden in the attic of that house is an original Rembrandt. So I know it's there. You don't know it. The other buyer doesn't know it, and the seller doesn't know it. I might be willing to pay $2 or $3 million for that house because I know I'm going to get the Rembrandt that comes with it that's in the attic. Every business has Rembrandts in their attic that are going to be valuable to a buyer over and above the discounted cash flow of the business. It might be some proprietary software you built. It might be your customer list. It might be your leadership team. It might be some products that you have that a particular buyer might be able to sell to their customer base. But there's a reason over and above the cash flow that a buyer might want to own your company. Now, savvy buyers don't point out the Rembrandts. It's your job as the seller to understand. You always want to know, why is a buyer interested in buying this company? What are the things that they see in mine over and above what they might see in someone else? Because it's not about buying the cash flow. If they can get it at a financial price, but get those Rembrandts in the attic for free, then they're going to be wildly enthusiastic to buy the business. It's your job as the seller to understand because what matters to buyer A, that Rembrandt might be irrelevant to buyer B. They might like something else. Knowing what they're really after, and then this is the most important part, reverse engineering the value of that Rembrandt. Not all Rembrandts are created equal. Reverse engineer the value of that strategic value driver for a given buyer, and help the buyer understand and see, hey, look, in the attic is an original Rembrandt, and to you, this would probably be worth somewhere in the range of X. So you don't assume that buyers are going to see the strategic value. It's your job to help them understand it, help them monetize it, and create a monetary value in their mind, and know what they are and what they're worth. That skill, more than anything I teach, more than anything I ever talk about, is the single most important value driver for entrepreneurs to understand about their business. Now, here's a hint. Almost all the time, it's the stuff you're so good at, you totally take for granted. It's so fundamentally core to the business, you assign no value to it because it's just how you do things. It could be process, it could be systems, all the things I just mentioned, but you take it so for granted, you don't even think about it as an asset, as a Rembrandt. And once you change your mindset, you can never look at your business the same way again. Once you start to look for those Rembrandts, for many of our clients, it becomes an obsession. They're obsessed with finding and creating additional Rembrandts, because why not have strategic value drivers in the attic when it's time to sell? That's the skill that we could end the podcast right now. That would be the one thing. If you said, what's one takeaway? That would be the takeaway. And it's fun. It's a great exercise for the senior team. Hey, what are we so good at? What do we take for granted around here that a buyer might absolutely love about our business? And yeah, that's the one thing. Make yourself redundant, super important, but deeply understand the Rembrandts in your business's attic. And every business we've ever worked with has them. And oftentimes they have no idea that they're there. And then I watch buyers come along in deals that we don't work on, and they know buyers are really good at figuring it out and not paying at all or underpaying for those strategic assets that come along as part of the financial valuation.
So let's look at that. That's brilliant. And same meaning. I've heard and used Rembrandt in the attic for years, and guess who I learned it from? A meeting with Andrew Sherman. So yep, props to that. And gosh, it's so right. So the two things: make yourself replaceable, and two, look for the Rembrandts. And the one thing that you hit, that because I've been on the buy side, so I probably wasn't thinking on the sell side, but one day ever pivoting to the sell side, need to remember that I have to also recognize the Rembrandt in the attic and point that out to the buyer of why they're getting and paying what they should pay because of that. So that's really a good data point to looking through it from both lenses. So a couple of things here. One is why, Matt. I want to dig a little bit of what this number can mean. And let me give you an example. If I think what my number or probably what I could sell for, and I have no intention of selling, but let's just pretend I did. If you look, I know what that number is. Okay. And, good number. And so you could say, good enough, don't need to be greedy. So why the bigger number? What comes to me is it's not greedy. It's, you said it earlier, like this is your life's work and not just for you or your family. So what clicks for me is I'd like to hear your why. And I'd like to more than that, hear number examples, because I think the audience hearing it can be like, oh, this is a serious miss if we don't get this right. So what I would say to the why is it's not about me anymore. It hasn't been for years. It's not even at this point stage of the game. It's not even about the family. We're good. This is about like this charity and nonprofit that my wife and I are so passionate about helping, like getting the number and not leaving that on the table if it's available to fund this huge mission that we're a part of and want to help. That's why it's like, boy, I would kick myself if I left X amount of money on the table when it was available and not be able to help out, some of these charities that we're so passionate about helping.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'll be a bit of a contrarian on this point. I'll say what I'll say, and it is what it is. But philanthropy at times is a broken model. I think a lot of philanthropy takes institutional dollars. They don't necessarily understand how to operate in entrepreneurial ways. They mismanage some of those dollars, and the beneficiaries that need whatever the philanthropy is about the most don't always get an optimal outcome. I actually believe that entrepreneurs are the best stewards of philanthropic dollars because they know what it's like to worry about payroll. They know what it's like to gut it out, especially the middle market entrepreneur, the $5 to $100 million entrepreneur that has probably been at the brink and stared into the abyss. And this isn't all about beat the odds, but a lot of times it's about, what it took to get there, and you tend to be less likely to squander a philanthropic dollar. So yes. The more value you can create in the exit process for the middle market entrepreneur, I think those dollars by definition get put to more optimal use. And yeah, I think it's our fiduciary responsibility. Go ahead.
No, I want to touch on this because this is right on time for me. So I couldn't agree more. I have most of my life struggled with nonprofit and charities and not helping. We've always been involved, whether it's economically with money or just being involved with things that are important to us. And that's key. Like that's the idea, is like your heart's in it. But I've struggled with the exact same thing. One, and I think I heard this from Dan Sullivan originally, the idea of giving back. Well, if you're bringing value and getting compensated for bringing value, it's not giving back. That's one. Yeah. Two is exactly that. Like we are in this process of let's create a new model. So you struck a chord here with me because literally there's a group like we want to help that our heart couldn't be more in it. It's the right thing. It's the right thing. They need, and it may be us stepping in or somehow, or maybe some of my team. But the point is, just giving money is not the answer because that's not their skill set to understand what's the highest and best use of being able to do this. And to me, it needs to be sustaining anyway. Like how can they self-sustain and not need the influx of capital? How can we create this in such a way where this is a self-sustaining model and what that perpetuates? That's the answer. So I would love if you have thoughts on that to share.
Yeah, for the same reasons. If you leave dollars on the table that could have been invested to create a perpetual model. I mean, the ultimate philanthropy, you're exactly right, is one that could stop fundraising tomorrow and exist in perpetuity. And it takes capital to do that. And it takes understanding, investing and long-term and 100-year event horizons and all those things. And, every dollar paid in tax or left on the table is probably suboptimal to a dollar invested in a perpetual philanthropy model. I know that probably sounds borderline arrogant, and I know we all need to pay taxes, and I get all that, but I would trust you a hell of a lot more than I would trust a dollar gone in taxes to be optimized in terms of the greater good. And I think
I get it.
Yeah, we lose sight of that, and I think we get sold. I hate politics to my core, but I think we get sold a bit of a bill of goods about what our duty is as citizens, and how tax dollars should be allocated and all those things. I would always rather the big problems in the world are going to be solved by entrepreneurs. They're not going to be solved by governments and big institutions. I think we've been through the pandemic scaling up the coaches organization. We're coaching about 2,500 entrepreneurs around the globe, and we've been referring to them as the first responders of the global economy. And they really were. I mean, we watched as, the world changed a lot in the last 2 years. The entrepreneurs that were about the mission and had their systems and process and businesses optimized really thrived in this environment and saved a lot of jobs and created a lot of amazing outcomes. And so we're all about the entrepreneur. So you're never going to have to convince me that a dollar spent elsewhere is probably not as optimal as a dollar with an entrepreneur. So couldn't agree more on that.
Well, on that point, John, so like that's what Legato Family's about. The company we launched last year is how do you create what we're calling 7th generation family constitutions? How do you create a family constitution because look, years ago, they didn't dump this pile of money they didn't have liquid assets. So they were passing values on to the next generation and things they learned, core values. So basically what Legato is, what we do for our business, why don't we do that for our family? Why don't we have core values and a mission and a vision and colors and maybe spirit animals and maybe a crest of what's important to us as a family, who we are, and leave that for generations to come. And then the money piece, give opportunities. So this is what typically happens with wealthy entrepreneurs from my experience, and I've had to now wrestle with this. Okay, so you don't want to create entitlement. So I don't want to dump this big pile of money in the kids' laps or the grandkids' laps. Okay, so what do? I'm not going to deal with that. We're going to give it to charity. Well, it's the same thing. They didn't work for it either. So it's like they don't know what to do with it either. It's right, kind of what you were saying earlier. So I'm totally on board with that. So it's like, okay, so what we've created here is let's create a family constitution, 7th generation family constitution, 7th generation coming from the Iroquois Nation and Great Law of Peace. So, our ancestors, this wisdom of thinking 7 generations now. How's this going to affect our family, other families, the plant family, the animal kingdom? How's it going to affect everybody? Healthy way to think. And then make that the guidepost to the trust. So versus giving it all to a charity. So yeah, I don't have the answer on the best way to solve the charity piece, meaning how do you help a cause you're passionate about and doing it a way that's sustainable? The only way I would know or think about doing that would be having some involvement to set it up like rock habits for methodologies. We call it the 4 P's: purpose, people, process, and profit, and get this thing off the ground so it's self-sustaining and not needing to fundraise.
Well, and again, every situation is different, but if the exit is significant enough, you may have the opportunity to create your own family's foundation as opposed to have to give to other foundations that are likely. And I've been super lucky, and it's a long story, certainly not for today, but sat on the advisory board for Virgin Unite with the Bransons for probably 5 or 6 years. And, I know Richard's kids really well, and they are tremendous stewards of everything you just described. They're stewards of the planet. They're super, super good people. They have causes that they care deeply about and invest not only their family's wealth, but significant amounts of their time and energy in. And they really, to me, have cracked the code. And again, we're not all going to be Richard Branson, but you don't need billions to create a family foundation. You look at athletes, a lot of athletes have their own family foundation. If the exit is significant enough and philanthropy is at your core, that to me is one of the best ways to teach your kids not only stewardship but also entrepreneurship, right? Because now you can serve both goals where, yeah, you're giving and you're not entitling kids, but you can get your kids involved in directing the giving and seeing the direct benefits to hard work and wealth creation, as opposed to, here's a Ferrari and a ski trip to Vail. So
100%.
I'm a huge fan of the Family Foundation.
Yeah, I love it. And I am too. Yeah, it's a great point. And then even if your kids weren't interested, it's your foundation. So you can run it like you did your company, where you set up your processes and you got key people with core values that can run it. So it is efficient and it is going to be sustainable. So yeah, it's a great point. One of the things that my partner in Legato, Rich, has set up is this rites of passage for kids in the next generations at 8, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20. And gosh, what a brilliant job he's done. He's started over 52 companies, so he's an entrepreneur at his core of DNA, but he's done an amazing job with his kids and family as far as creating non-entitlement and with these rites of passage that the indigenous used to do, and we've just lost it. So
yeah, Vern. So you mentioned Vern Harnish. Vern's kids, he's got 4 kids, and his youngest just did his rite of passage. They do one, I think, at 13, but same thing, A Night in the Woods and the spirit animal, all of it. So I've had, and we haven't done that with our kids, but I've gotten to watch Vern's kids grow up and go through it. And it's been a really powerful process. So
it is.
To bring that up.
It is. That's an interesting, sync up of things that work. Again, take an ancestral wisdom and bring it to current times and technology, I think, is a good thing to do. Don't throw all that wisdom out. Speaking of wisdom, John, we had talked about making yourself replaceable. We talked about Rembrandt's and the why. What's example of numbers? Like if you don't get it right, what kind of numbers have you seen that impact be?
So if you don't get it right.
Yeah. So in other words, if you could sell, a company for maybe 10, either way you want to take it. But basically the point is, I think not everyone understands the upside of strategic selling. Yeah.
So we worked with an entrepreneur this year, and oftentimes we get called in at the 11th hour. So a friend of a friend has signed a bad LOI and they're, hurtling down the path to get closed. And the friend recognizes, but can't really say that it's not an optimal outcome. So they call me and say, hey, can you help out? I got called in earlier in 21. It was probably summertime of 21 on a deal. It was a $12 million transaction. And through a series of bad, I'll just say, suboptimal negotiating on behalf of the buyer, or maybe unscrupulous negotiating on behalf of the buyer, the seller was leaving about $6 million on the table. So what looked like 12 was really 9, and it should have been 15. So it was $3 million underpriced. And I'm talking about market. That had they gone out and run a process, might have been $5 or $6 million underpriced. And what was represented as value in the deal was wildly overvalued, because he was going to leave capital in the company that was buying him. And they had overvalued that part of the transaction by 3. So on a $12 million deal, it was really worth 9, should have been worth 15. There was a $6 million delta. And that's, 50% of the transaction. We were able to get, and again, when I got called in, they were about 4 or 5 days away from their close. We were able to salvage probably about 2 million of the 6. So they still left 4 on the table. I really, 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 really pissed off the buyers because they knew they were 6 million shy of where they should have been, but we were able to get 2 million of it back and probably protect another 2 million from we cut the rollover in half. So the amount of equity he was going to leave in, we got cut in half. So we probably left $2 million more in a way less risky capital situation. So,
Nice.
And that was the 11th hour. So and again, they're seemingly, and buyers are good. I mean, these buyers were really good. These buyers sold a story and told a tale and acted like they were, his best friends. And, when they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar at the 11th hour, like I said, they were wildly, wildly upset, angry with me, but ultimately came to the table and did a little bit more of the right thing. The other thing that happens, and this is, we don't talk about this as much. I actually call it the Mark Zuckerberg effect. The media really, really sensationalizes a lot of really bad behavior in terms of exit strategy. So you get to hear about A round and B round and C round and raising venture money and raising capital, and it's sexy, and it's like we talk about unicorns all the time, but none of that is based in fundamentals. We had another client about 4 years ago that was a fintech software as a service company, and because some guys in his forum and some friends of his said you have to go raise capital, that's what you do when you're a software company. He raised a very paltry $8 million total in 4 different rounds, but inadvertently in those 4 rounds of $8 million capital raise, diluted himself by 95%. So he ended up with 5% of a company that he could have owned outright by taking on capital he didn't need for growth. In fact, most of it sat in a bank account. And when it came time to sell, he had a $15 million fintech company that was worth somewhere between $150 and $200 million. And for no reason whatsoever, he diluted himself 95%. Again, I got called in at the 11th hour. We were able basically to go back to the one main investor and say, you and I both know that this was not the way this should have gone down. And we got him back to 25% ownership instead of 5, because he was ready to walk. He was literally ready to walk away because he was and talk about happiness versus unhappiness. He was a pretty unhappy guy when he realized. And again, you look at it and go, well, that would never happen to me. It was the way the docs were built. It was a very complex structure on the investment. It wasn't that, he was dumb. He just got out-lawyered and ended up in a bad spot. And it was his willingness to walk away and our negotiating that got him back to 25%. So he ended up with a decent outcome, but left arguably maybe 100 million plus on the table. That'll really mess with your psyche for a long time. And it was capital. If it was capital he needed, it'd be one thing. He did it because someone told him this is what you're supposed to do. So, and there's 100 more stories. Like we could spend a week.
100%. And look, this is the 2 things. One, if you're open to it, a couple more things I want to talk to you about it. We can do another podcast if you're cool with it, John. I would love to. I mean, I even want to dig a little further in some thoughts I have on this family foundation and how, you and Vern's work could be a part of that. And we could talk about that and what you've learned, from Virgin, it being done right. Here's what I'll say as I wrap things up, knowing I'm having you back on. And that is, this is the time to get this right. Like this is your biggest asset, always is. And so you want to get it right. And I think what happens for most, and this has been my experience, and my buddy David, right? He's worked with me on all my deals, and then you as well with one. And the point of that is this. I think what people need to know, and I've been fortunate enough to have this, and that is I had someone that had my back. I always had my gotcha guy. And that's not just lip service. Like, I mean, I knew they had my back. So it wasn't a paycheck. Obviously, we all need paid. I just always went into both buy and sell side. And I think that's what people just need to know. They need to know I got my guy or gal, and I got my team, and they got my back. Yeah. And then, man, it just takes because it's not your world. You need to learn, and you need to prepare, and you need to do it yesterday. So if you haven't started yesterday, then today start figuring out How do you make yourself replaceable? How can you focus on what's the Rembrandt in the attic that you can maximize the sell on, or if you're buying? And then third, find someone who you believe that you are confident has your back. And so what I'll say with that, I'm, super comfortable with you, John, and know, what you represent and how you do it. How would people find more about you if they wanted to say, hey, I want to start going down this path and considering working with someone?
Yeah. So our website's very simple. It's Align 5. It's ALIGN and then the number 5.com. I had mentioned to you earlier, we host an exit strategy retreat similar to the CEO bootcamp that you attended down in Marathon, where we do a 4-day, three days of content, but a 4-day intensive on pretty much everything to think about in terms of exit strategy, from I think this might be something I want to do down the road, all the way to, what am I going to do post-transaction? And there's so many little and big things to think about along the way. The one I always laugh about is, and again, I always like 1 or 2 key takeaways. So the Rembrandts, for me, key takeaway, I'm going to throw the most inane, weird thing out there, but anyone listening to this podcast that uses their business email address as their personal email address, when you sell the company, and for some of us, that's 15, 20 years of using that email address as our personal one. When you sell the company, you have sold your personal email address. So it's bizarre and it sounds completely innocuous, but one of the things we teach is get all your personal stuff off of your business email address. And that's for those of us that are 50 plus that didn't understand email addresses when we got our first one and happen to be using the same one we've been using for a long time. So, but it's that kind of stuff. It's the gotchas. It's the little things and the big things that you don't think about. So that's what we talk about at Exit Strategy Retreat. We have a couple coming up in March, but more than anything, so on our website we've got some resources and stuff. There's a white paper, the 7 traps that savvy buyers use against unsuspecting sellers. You can get that on the website as well. So yeah, the analogy we use, it's kind of like when you're going to go up against a really good buyer. So let's say it's a PE firm that's done 30 transactions this year or last year. We're in January, but 30 transactions in 2021. You're selling the first company you've ever sold. It's the equivalent of getting your grandfather's golf clubs out of the attic and getting on the first tee. And I used to say Tiger Woods, but Tiger not anymore. But you're on the first tee and it's Dustin Johnson or even the local club pro. The chances you have on the first tee are 0. And that's what's happening every day in M&A. And it's tragic. And my mission in life is to help level that playing field, because it's just, it's a bloodbath, or can be a bloodbath. Not every time, but 80-20 for sure, 90-10 probably. If you're going it alone and you've never done it. I had a conversation last week with, again, someone called me in and said, hey, these guys have a letter of intent. And, we looked at it. We looked at the transaction. Great entrepreneur. She's been running her company for 15 years, super successful, and was about to get absolutely taken to the cleaners. And we were able to talk her out of that particular LOI and most likely out of that buyer altogether based on how they showed up. So yeah, it's not good. What's going on is it's not good. So
it's beautiful, man. I look forward to having you back on, John. And I'll just end with what I started. And that's the beauty to me of having someone who's been there and done that. And the thing that I'll add to that is it's one thing to sell. And candidly, most businesses are, say, $1 million. If you just look at the majority of the businesses out there, and there's nothing wrong with that and nothing against that. But if you're, if that's the business you sold and now you're talking about a $50 million sell or 25, it's a totally different animal. And so John's been there, done that. That's been in the space he's played. And that's why it was exciting to have him on my podcast, because they're people like me, 5 million to 100 million in revenue. So they're going to be selling probably in that range and even up. And so you need someone who understands it. And to me, even more importantly, like has lived it. So just like obviously Rembrandt's key takeaway, but then even the data on the email of business and personal and blended like that, had you not done it, you wouldn't know these things because that's what happened to you. Right. And so I
learned that lesson the hard way. When I figured out some 23-year-old IT kid was reading my emails. That was not a good day. So that was 100% from experience.
Oops. And look, man, that's it. When I health, wealth, wisdom, happiness, one of the things on wisdom is experiences. That's what creates wisdom. So John's certainly a wise guy, definitely in the buy sell space. So thanks for coming on. Check out align5.com and his workshops and everything that he offers. I'm going to have you back on. Thanks for saying that you're open to that. And with that group, we'll catch you next week on the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple so that you can fully live. You can fully live now. Catch you next week.
The opinions voiced in Way to Wealth with Scott Ford, Managing Director, Partner, and Wealth Advisor of Carson Wealth, are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial or tax advisor prior to investing. Guests on Way to Wealth are not affiliated with CWM LLC or Cetera Advisor Networks LLC. Legato family is not affiliated with Cetera Advisor Networks LLC or CWM LLC. Carson Wealth, 19833 Leitersburg Pike, Suite 1, Hagerstown, Maryland, 21742.